Well, hello there, my dear friends. Come on in. Settle into that comfortable chair by the window, and let me pour you a steaming cup of something warm while we gather close together for a little while. I'm Joe, though most folks around these parts have grown to call me Grandpa Joe over the years. And I'm deeply grateful that you've chosen to spend part of your precious day here with me. You know, at 60, I've come to understand that the stories that shape us most profoundly aren't always the ones that make us smile or fill us with pride. Sometimes, the stories that carve themselves deepest into our hearts are the ones that break us wide open, that strip away everything we thought we knew about what matters, and teach us truths so beautiful and painful that they change us forever. Today, I want to share one of those stories with you, a story about my father, about fishing, about loss, and about discovering that life's most precious treasures aren't always the ones we can hold in our trembling hands. Before we dive into this deeply personal journey together, if these conversations we're having bring you comfort during quiet moments, perhaps stir up bittersweet memories of your own loved ones, or simply provide a gentle voice when the world feels overwhelmingly silent, I would be truly honored if you'd consider subscribing to our little corner of hope here on the internet. It helps me reach other souls who might need to hear these stories of love and loss and finding meaning in the midst of heartbreak. And it tells me that what we're sharing together has genuine value in your life. Now, let me take you back to a time that feels both like yesterday and an entire lifetime ago. The autumn of 2019, when I learned that some of life's most profound lessons come not from what we manage to catch, but from what we choose to cherish while we still have the chance. Picture, if you will, a crisp October morning when the leaves were just beginning their magnificent transformation, painting our small Michigan town in shades of gold and crimson that made you catch your breath with their beauty. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast for 30 years, where my children had done homework and shared their daily adventures, where life had unfolded in all its ordinary, precious detail, enjoying what I thought would be just another routine cup of coffee while scanning the morning paper. The phone rang at 8:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the kitchen clock, annoyed at the interruption of my peaceful morning ritual. If I had known that this single phone call would divide my life into before and after, I might have let it ring, but that's not how life works. Is it? The moments that change everything often arrive disguised as ordinary interruptions. It was my father calling from Dr. Patterson's office, the oncologist whose waiting room we'd all hoped Dad would never need to see. At 87, Dad had been experiencing symptoms that we'd all been trying to explain away. Fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, a persistent cough that seemed to echo from somewhere deep in his chest, and a gradual loss of appetite that had my mother pacing the kitchen at night, counting the bites he'd taken at dinner. "Son," he said, and I could hear in those two syllables the enormous effort it was taking for him to keep his voice steady. My father, the man who had never met a problem he couldn't solve, never faced a challenge he couldn't overcome, was struggling to find words for something that had no solution. "The doctor says I've got lung cancer, Joe, stage 4, spread to my liver, maybe my bones. They're talking about treatments, but..." His voice cracked slightly, just for a moment, before he gathered himself again. "They're saying maybe 6 months if we don't do anything, maybe a year if we try everything they've got, maybe less, maybe more, Tasso. Nobody really knows, and my friends, and there are moments in life when time fractures. When the familiar world around you continues its normal rhythm, coffee cooling in your cup, newspaper rustling in the morning breeze, birds singing outside your window, while you feel like you're falling through empty space. Watching everything you've taken for granted suddenly become impossibly precious and terrifyingly fragile. Then I set my coffee cup down with shaking hands, watching the steam curl up from the surface while my father's words echoed in my head like stones dropped into a deep well. Lung cancer, stage 4, 6 months. The numbers felt abstract, impossible. like a medical diagnosis meant for someone else's family, someone else's father. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Dad, I'm so sorry." What do you want to do?" What followed was a 25-minute conversation that I replay in my mind almost daily. Even now, 3 years later, we talked about treatment options, chemotherapy that might buy time but would certainly steal quality of life, radiation that might shrink tumors but would leave him exhausted and sick. We discussed second opinions and specialist consultations and all the desperate grasping that families do when faced with the unthinkable. But underneath all the medical terminology and treatment protocols, I could hear something in Dad's voice that I'd never heard before in my 60 years of being his son. Not fear, exactly, but a quiet urgency, as if he was already beginning the enormous work of deciding what mattered most in whatever time remained. "Joe," he said near the end of our call, his voice taking on the particular tone he'd always used when he wanted to make sure I was really listening. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left in hospitals and treatment centers, feeling sick and scared and sorry for myself. I want to spend it living, really living, doing the things that matter with the people I love." After we hung up, I sat in that kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at my untouched coffee and trying to process what felt like an impossible new reality. How do you begin to wrap your mind around losing someone who has been the bedrock of your entire existence? How do you prepare for a world without the person who taught you how to tie your shoes, how to throw a baseball, how to be a good man? My father had been the constant in my life for 60 years. He'd worked 32 years at the Ford plant, never missing a day unless one of us kids was sick. He'd built the house I grew up in with his own calloused hands, board by board, room by room, creating a home where 4 children could grow up safe and loved. And he'd never missed a single one of my baseball games. Even when it meant leaving work early or driving through snowstorms, he was the one who taught me to change a car's oil, to treat women with respect, to keep my word no matter what it cost me. And now, for the first time in my life, my father was facing something he couldn't fix, couldn't solve, couldn't power through with determination and hard work. I called my wife Patricia, my beloved Patricia, who'd known me for 38 years and could read my emotions before I fully understood them myself. She was at her school counseling office, probably helping some teenager navigate the complexities of adolescence, when her phone rang. "Something's wrong," she said immediately, hearing something in my voice that made her stop whatever she was doing and give me her complete attention. "What's happened?" When I told her about Dad's diagnosis, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I'm coming home. Right now. Cancel whatever you have planned today. We need to be together, and we need to think about how we're going to help your parents through this." Patricia arrived home 40 minutes later, with tears already streaming down her face, carrying a box of tissues and a bottle of the bourbon that Dad liked to sip on special occasions. We sat together on our living room couch, the same couch where we'd celebrated our children's achievements, where we'd comforted each other through various losses and disappointments, where we'd built a marriage strong enough to weather whatever storms came our way, and we cried together for the future that was being taken away from all of us. That afternoon, I drove the 45 minutes to my parents' house in a daze, the familiar route passing by in a blur of autumn colors that seemed almost mockingly beautiful given the devastation I was feeling. The house where I'd grown up looked exactly the same as it always had: white clapboard siding, green shutters, a small front porch where Mom still put out seasonal decorations. But everything felt different now, charged with the terrible knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. I found Dad in his workshop in the basement, the place where he'd retreated whenever he needed to think through a problem or work with his hands to calm his mind, and the familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil enveloped me as I descended the stairs, bringing back 1,000 memories of childhood afternoons spent watching him craft furniture, fix broken toys, create something beautiful from raw wood. He was sitting at his workbench, not actually working on anything, just holding a piece of sandpaper and staring at a half-finished birdhouse he'd been making for Mom's garden. When he looked up and saw me, his face crumpled for just a moment before he gathered himself again. "Joe," he said, standing to embrace me with arms that felt frailer than I remembered, but still strong enough to hold his son while his world was falling apart. We held each other for a long time in that workshop. Two grown men trying to find comfort in each other's presence, while grappling with the reality that our time together was now measurable in months rather than years. I could feel his shoulders shaking slightly, and I realized that my strong, stoic father was crying, something I'd only seen him do twice before in my entire life. "I'm scared, son," he whispered into my shoulder, his voice muffled and broken. "Not of dying, Ezekiel, but of leaving you all, of not being here when you need me, of missing the rest of your life, the rest of the grandkids' lives. And there's so much I still want to say, so much I still want to do with you." Those words hit me like a physical blow. My father, the man who had never admitted weakness, who had always been the one we turned to when we were scared, was telling me he was afraid to see it. And in that moment, I understood that the roles we'd played my entire life were shifting in ways that terrified me. We talked for nearly 2 hours in that workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had defined so much of Dad's identity over the years. He told me about the treatments Dr. Patterson had recommended, about the side effects and success rates, and all the clinical realities of fighting a disease that had already progressed too far for optimism. "I'm going to try some of the treatments," he said, running his weathered hands over the smooth surface of the birdhouse. "Not because I think they're going to cure me, but because I want to buy us as much time as possible. Time to say everything we need to say. Time to do a few things together that we've been putting off. And time to make sure you're all going to be okay without me." Then he looked up at me with eyes that held 60 years of memories and love and loss, and said something that changed the trajectory of both our remaining time together. "Joe, there's something I've been thinking about since I left the doctor's office this morning. You know how we've always talked about taking a real fishing trip together? Not just those afternoon excursions to Miller's Pond, but a proper adventure to one of those legendary fishing spots we've been reading about for years?" I nodded, remembering countless conversations over the decades about someday taking a trip to Lake Michigan, where his grandfather had taken him as a boy, where the salmon ran thick in the fall and the water stretched to the horizon like an inland sea. "I think now's the time," he said with more conviction than I'd heard in his voice since the phone call that morning. "Before the treatments start making me sick, before I get too weak for adventures. I want to go fishing with my son while I still can, while I can still be the father instead of the patient." His voice grew stronger as he continued, as if the simple act of planning something hopeful was giving him strength. "I've been reading about charter boat services out of Traverse City. The salmon are supposed to be running strong this time of year. October fishing on the Great Lakes, doesn't that sound like something worth doing?" What he was really saying, indeed, of course, was that he wanted to create one last perfect memory together before cancer took away his ability to be fully present, fully himself. He wanted to give us both something beautiful to hold on to during the difficult months ahead. "When do you want to go?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "This weekend," he said without hesitation. "I've already started looking into it. There's a charter captain named Frank Morrison, no relation, but I like the name, who's been fishing those waters for 40 years. He says the fall salmon fishing has been the best in decades. And just like that, we were planning what neither of us wanted to acknowledge would almost certainly be our last fishing trip together. The week between that conversation and our departure felt suspended outside normal time. Every interaction with Dad carried extra weight. Every conversation seemed potentially significant. Found myself studying him with new intensity, the way his hands moved when he was telling a story, the particular laugh he made when something genuinely amused him, the expression on his face when he was concentrating on a difficult task, I watched him organize his tackle box with the methodical precision that had characterized everything he'd ever done. Each lure and weight and hook arranged exactly where he could find it in the dark. I memorized the ritual he followed every time he prepared his fishing gear, cleaning each reel, checking every line, making sure everything was in perfect working order before committing it to the water. "Come here, son," he said one evening as he worked at the kitchen table, surrounded by fishing equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Let me show you something." He held up an old wooden lure, its paint faded and chipped from decades of use. This was my father's favorite lure. He caught his biggest northern pike on this back in 1952, and he always said it was lucky. He gave it to me when I turned 16, told me it would bring me good fortune as long as I used it with respect. Dad's fingers traced the worn surface of the lure with infinite gentleness. "I want you to have it now. Not because I think I won't need it anymore, but because some things are too important to wait for the right moment to pass along." Taking that lure from my father's hands felt like receiving communion, like being entrusted with something sacred that connected me not just to him, but to generations of men in our family who had found solace and meaning in the simple act of casting a line into moving water. On the Friday morning of our trip, I arrived at my parents' house at 5 a.m. to find Dad already dressed and ready, sitting at the kitchen table with a thermos of coffee and a paper bag containing the sandwiches Mom had insisted on packing for us. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if the week of processing his diagnosis had somehow diminished his physical presence. But his eyes held an excitement that reminded me of the father who had taken me on my first camping trip 35 years earlier. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked. And for a moment, his voice carried the same enthusiasm it had held when I was 8 years old, and he was teaching me to cast from the dock at Miller's Pond. Mom was trying to be cheerful as she fussed over us, checking and rechecking that we had everything we needed. But I could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just a fishing trip for her. It was sending her husband of 57 years on what might be his last adventure, trusting me to bring him home safely one more time. "Make care of each other," she whispered as she hugged us both goodbye, her voice breaking slightly on the words, "and catch something wonderful." The drive to Traverse City took us through some of the most beautiful autumn landscape Michigan has to offer. The interstate wound through forests that blazed with the October colors so brilliant they seemed almost artificial, maple trees glowing like torches, oak leaves the color of burnished copper, birches dropping golden coins onto the road ahead of us. Dad was quieter than usual during the drive, but it wasn't the heavy silence of sadness or fear. It was the contemplative quiet of someone who was deliberately absorbing every detail of an experience he wanted to preserve forever. He'd brought along the thermos of his favorite coffee and a bag of chocolate chip cookies that Mom had made fresh that morning. And he offered to share both with the quiet generosity that had always defined his character. About an hour into the drive, as we passed through a particularly stunning stretch of countryside where the trees formed a cathedral of gold overhead, Dad began to tell me stories I'd never heard before. "Did I ever tell you about the first time my grandfather took me fishing?" he asked, settling back in his seat with the expression he always got when he was reaching deep into his collection of cherished memories. "I don't think so," she said, grateful for anything that would help me learn more about the man I was about to lose. I was 12 years old, and it was the summer of 1944. The war was still going on, and everything felt uncertain and frightening. My father was somewhere in the Pacific with the Navy, and we hadn't heard from him in months. My mother was working double shifts at the munitions factory, and I was spending most of my time with Grandpa Morrison. "Your great-grandfather?" Dad's voice took on the warm, nostalgic tone he always used when talking about his grandfather. Grandpa could see I was scared and angry about everything that was happening in the world. And I was at that age where you're starting to understand that adults don't have all the answers, that terrible things can happen to good people, that life isn't fair in ways that a 12-year-old shouldn't have to comprehend. He paused to sip his coffee, and I could see him traveling back in time to that summer more than 75 years ago. So Grandpa decided I needed a fishing trip. Not just an afternoon at the local creek, but a real expedition to Lake Michigan, where he'd been fishing since he was younger than I was. We drove up in his old Buick. This was before the interstate, so it took most of the day on those winding back roads. And we rented a little cabin right on the shore. What was it like? I asked, hungry for details about a part of Dad's life I'd never fully understood. Magic, he said simply. Pure magic. We'd wake up before dawn and walk down to the water with our gear, and the lake would be so calm it looked like a mirror reflecting the sky. Grandpa taught me how to read the water, how to understand what the fish were doing based on the wind and the temperature and the way the light hit the surface. Dad's eyes grew distant, as if he could see that long-ago lake stretching out in front of him. But the best part wasn't the fishing itself. It was the talking. Hours and hours of conversation while we waited for the fish to bite. Grandpa told me stories about his own father, about the early days of our family in Michigan, about what it meant to be a man when everything around you felt uncertain. Did you catch much? I asked. Some days we caught our limit. Some days we got skunked completely, Dad said with a smile. But Grandpa always said the same thing at the end of every day. Whether the cooler was full or empty, he'd look out at that vast lake and say, "We caught what we came for. Bobby, we caught perfect time together." As he told that story, I began to understand something that took my breath away. This trip we were taking wasn't just about Dad wanting to go fishing one more time. It was about him trying to give me what his grandfather had given him, not just the experience of being on the water together, but the deeper understanding that some of life's most important gifts can't be measured or weighed or mounted on a wall. We checked into the same type of small, family-owned motel that Dad had stayed at with his grandfather all those years ago. Our rooms were side by side, connected by walls thin enough that we could hear each other moving around as we unpacked our gear and prepared for the next morning's adventure. That evening, as the sun was setting over Grand Traverse Bay, Dad knocked on my door with a bottle of the good bourbon, the kind he only brought out for special occasions, and 2 glasses he'd borrowed from the motel office. "Thought we might have a proper planning session," he said, but I could see in his eyes that this was about more than planning. This was about creating a moment of connection, a memory that would have to last me for whatever years remained after he was gone. We sat on the small porch outside our rooms, watching the last light fade over the water, while we sipped our drinks and talked about everything except the cancer. We discussed fishing techniques and weather patterns, family memories and friends from decades past, all the accumulation of shared history that makes up the relationship between a father and son. But mostly we just sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of waves lapping against the nearby shore and breathing in air that carried the scent of pine and lake water and possibility. "Joe," Dad said as we were preparing to head inside for the night, "I need you to know something. Tomorrow isn't about proving anything or accomplishing anything specific. It's not about whether we catch fish or not. It's just about spending a day on the water with my son, and that's already more than I have any right to hope for." His voice broke slightly on those last words, and I realized that he was as emotional about this experience as I was, that he understood the weight of what we were creating together. "I love you, Dad," I said. Words that felt both completely natural and impossibly significant given everything we were facing. "I love you too, son," he replied. "More than you'll ever know. And tomorrow, no matter what happens with the fish, we're going to create something beautiful together. Something that will outlast both of us." I went to sleep that night with my heart full of anticipation and dread, listening to the sound of my father moving around in the room next to mine and trying to memorize everything about this moment. The sound of the water, the cool October air, the knowledge that I was about to share one last perfect day with the man who had shaped everything good about who I'd become. We woke at 5 a.m. to the kind of October morning that makes you grateful to be alive and terrifies you with its beauty, because you know how quickly such perfection can disappear. The air was crisp and clean, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and orange, and Lake Michigan stretched out before us like a vast mirror, reflecting the awakening world. And our charter captain, Frank Morrison, met us at the marina with a handshake that spoke of 40 years working with ropes and nets, and the kind of men who find God in the early morning silence of deep water. His boat looked like it had seen countless adventures and was ready for countless more, equipped with everything we'd need for a day of serious fishing. "Morning, gentlemen," Frank said, studying Dad with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading people as carefully as he read weather patterns. "Perfect day for it. Lake's calm, fish have been biting steady all week, and the weather report promises sunshine and light winds until evening." Dad was already dressed in his fishing clothes, the same canvas jacket he'd worn on fishing trips throughout my childhood. A baseball cap so broken in it looked like it had molded itself to his head, and boots that showed the patina of decades spent on boat decks and muddy riverbanks. Despite the changes that illness had already begun to work on his body, there was something about being back in his fishing gear that made him look more like himself than he had in weeks. As we loaded our equipment onto the boat, I watched my father move with careful deliberation, each action purposeful despite the obvious effort it required. He wasn't as quick or as strong as he'd once been, but there was something beautiful about the way he handled his gear, each movement the result of a lifetime spent perfecting rituals that brought him peace and joy. "Your dad knows what he's doing," Frank observed as he watched Dad organize his tackle box with surgical precision. "Man who takes care of his equipment like that, he's been doing this for a while." We motored out of the marina just as the sun cleared the horizon, turning the water into a sheet of molten gold that stretched to the edge of the world. The boat's engine settled into a steady rhythm as we headed toward Frank's favorite fishing spot, about 3 miles offshore where the water deepened and the salmon gathered during their fall migration. The ride out gave us time to settle into the peaceful rhythm of the day. Mia sat in the stern, watching the shoreline gradually recede while the vast expanse of Lake Michigan opened up around us. There's something almost spiritual about being on deep water in the early morning, when the world feels fresh and infinite, when you're far enough from shore that all you can see is water and sky stretching beyond the horizon. "Look at that," Dad said softly, pointing to a formation of geese flying overhead in perfect V formation, their calls echoing across the water. They know exactly where they're going and exactly how to work together to get there. Always figured there was something we could learn from watching them. As we approached Frank's chosen fishing spot, the depth finder showed 60 feet of water beneath us, deep enough for the salmon to feel safe, shallow enough for them to move up to feed when conditions were right. Frank cut the engine and let the boat settle into the gentle rhythm of the swells. "This is it, gentlemen," he announced. "Current's perfect, temperature's ideal, and I marked a good school of fish here yesterday evening. Time to see what Lake Michigan wants to share with us today." The next several minutes were spent rigging our lines with the focused attention that serious fishing demands. Dad chose a silver spoon lure that had brought him success with salmon for decades, while I opted for a bright spinner that Frank recommended for the current conditions. The ritual of preparing our equipment felt almost ceremonial, checking drag settings, testing knots, making sure everything was perfect before committing our hopes to the water. "Ready when you are," Frank said, positioning the boat so we could drift naturally with the current while our lures worked through the water where fish were most likely to be feeding. Dad cast first, his line sailing out over the water with the practiced grace of someone who'd been perfecting this motion for 70 years. Despite his age and the changes that illness was already working on his body, his casting technique was still smooth and confident, a perfect example of muscle memory that transcends time and physical limitations. I cast next, and we settled into the meditative rhythm that every serious fisherman knows, the slow, patient process of working our lures through the water while staying alert for any sign that a fish might be interested in what we had to offer. For the first hour, we caught nothing. Not even a nibble, not even the faintest suggestion that there might be life in the water below us. Frank assured us that this was normal, that salmon fishing often required patience and persistence, that the fish would become active when they were ready and not a moment before. Fishing's a lot like life, Dad said as we continued working our lines through the water with steady, hopeful rhythm. Nothing dramatic seems to be happening. You just keep doing the right things, being patient, staying alert, and then when you least expect it, something wonderful comes along and changes everything. But as the morning progressed and our lack of success became increasingly apparent, I began to worry that this trip, this precious, irreplaceable day that was supposed to create perfect memories, was going to be a disappointment. And what if we didn't catch anything? What if Dad's last fishing trip was a complete failure? Then I looked at my father, expecting to see frustration or disappointment in his face, and instead saw something that stopped me cold. He was completely, genuinely content. Despite our empty lines and the growing certainty that the fish weren't cooperating, Dad looked more peaceful and happy than I'd seen him since his diagnosis. "You know what's wonderful about this," he said, seeming to read my thoughts. "I'm sitting on a beautiful lake with my son, doing something we both love, on a perfect October morning. Whether we catch fish or not, this is already exactly what I hoped for." On and around 10 a.m., Frank suggested we move to a different spot, a reef area where he'd had success with salmon the previous week. As we motored to the new location, Dad remained remarkably cheerful despite our lack of success, clearly more interested in soaking up every detail of the experience than in whether we had anything to show for our efforts. "Tell me about your work," he said as we settled into the new fishing spot. "Tell me about your students, about the books you're reading with them, about the moments when you see them discover something that changes how they understand the world." So I told him about my students, about the shy teenager who'd found her voice through poetry, about the class clown who'd written an essay that brought tears to my eyes, about the daily miracles that reminded me why I'd become a teacher in the first place. Dad listened with the kind of complete attention that made me feel like these stories were the most important things he could possibly be hearing. "You're doing sacred work," he said when I finished describing a particularly successful lesson about finding meaning in literature, teaching young people to think critically, to express themselves clearly, to see beauty and significance in the world around them. That's the kind of work that creates ripples through generations. Those kids will carry what you've given them for the rest of their lives, and they'll pass it on to their own children. As noon approached, and our continued lack of fish became impossible to ignore, Frank made another suggestion about changing locations, but Dad held up his hand with a gentle smile that transformed the entire dynamic of our day. "Frank, this has been absolutely perfect exactly as it is," he said with a conviction that surprised both the captain and me. Sometimes the best fishing happens when you're not trying so hard to catch something specific. And sometimes the point isn't what you bring home, it's what you experience while you're out here. It was in that moment that I realized something profound was happening. Facing a terminal diagnosis and knowing this was likely his last fishing trip, wasn't disappointed or frustrated by our lack of success. He was genuinely, completely grateful for exactly what the day had given us. Time together on beautiful water, conversations that deepened our connection, the simple pleasure of being present to a perfect autumn morning. When we spent the afternoon fishing one more spot, a shallow area near shore where Frank had seen salmon jumping the evening before. The October sun warmed our backs as we cast and retrieved, settling into the hypnotic rhythm that makes fishing as much meditation as sport. Around 2 p.m., I felt a sharp strike on my line, the unmistakable sensation of a fish taking the lure and running hard with it. My rod bent dramatically, and the reel's drag sang as line disappeared into the depths. "Fish on," Frank called out, clearly excited by the first real action of the day. For the next 12 minutes, I fought what felt like a substantial salmon, feeling it make powerful runs toward deep water and then slowly gaining line as I worked it back toward the boat. Dad was more excited than I was, offering encouragement and advice. His face lit up with the kind of pure joy that comes from watching someone you love experience a moment of triumph. "That's it. Son, keep steady pressure. Don't let him get under to the boat," Dad called out. And for those few minutes, he wasn't a cancer patient facing an uncertain future. He was just a father sharing a perfect fishing moment with his son. But just as Frank was reaching for the landing net, just as we could see the flash of silver in the water below us, the fish made one final, desperate run and threw the hook. In an instant, my line went slack, and the salmon was gone. "Oh, that's heartbreaking," Frank said, clearly disappointed. "That was a beautiful fish, probably 10 or 12 pounds. What a fighter." I expected to feel crushed. This was our one chance for success, our opportunity to salvage what had seemed like it might be a disappointing day. But when I looked at Dad, I saw something that changed my understanding of success and failure forever. He was beaming, absolutely radiant with joy and excitement. "That was magnificent," he said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. "Did you feel how strong that fish was? Did you see the way it fought for its freedom? That salmon earned its escape today. And we got to be part of something wild and beautiful." So in that moment, I understood something that would reshape how I thought about achievement and disappointment for the rest of my life. My father wasn't disappointed that we hadn't landed the fish. He was grateful that we'd had the opportunity to connect with something powerful and wild, even briefly. He was celebrating the experience itself, not mourning the outcome we'd failed to achieve. "You know what that fish gave us?" Dad continued, his eyes bright with tears of pure happiness. "It gave us a story we'll tell for the rest of our lives. It gave us 12 minutes of excitement and beauty and connection to something beyond ourselves. That's worth more than any fish we could have brought home." As we headed back to the marina that afternoon, our cooler empty of fish but our hearts full of something infinitely more valuable, Dad sat quietly in the stern watching the shoreline approach. The day had been everything we'd hoped for and nothing like what we'd planned. Perfect weather, beautiful water, meaningful conversation, and not a single fish to show for our efforts. "Joe," he said as the marina came into view, "I want to tell you something that I hope you'll remember long after I'm gone." I turned to face him, seeing him silhouetted against the afternoon light reflecting off the water, looking smaller and frailer than I wanted to acknowledge, but somehow more essentially himself than ever. Today reminded me of the most important lesson my grandfather ever taught me, something I've spent 70 years learning to understand. The best catches in life aren't the ones you can hold in your hands or mount on your wall or measure with a ruler. The best catches are the ones that happen inside you, the moments of connection, the experiences of beauty, the time spent with people you love. He gestured toward the vast expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out behind us. "We came out here hoping to catch salmon, and we didn't bring home a single fish, but we caught something infinitely more valuable. We caught perfect time together. We caught conversations that deepened our understanding of each other. We caught the experience of being exactly where we were supposed to be, doing exactly what we were supposed to be doing." His voice grew stronger as he continued, as if this truth was giving him strength in the face of everything he was facing. "We caught memories that will last longer than any fish we could have brought home. We caught the knowledge that love doesn't depend on success or achievement. It depends on showing up for each other, being present to whatever life offers us." As we tied up at the dock and unloaded our gear, I realized that Dad had been orchestrating this lesson all along. The fishing trip was never really about fishing. It was about teaching me to recognize and appreciate gifts that can't be measured by conventional standards, to find meaning and satisfaction in experiences rather than achievements. When that evening, we had dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the bay, sharing a meal and talking about the day's adventure, while other fishermen at nearby tables showed off photos of their catches. But Dad and I were measuring our success by entirely different criteria, by the quality of time we'd spent together, by the conversations we'd shared, by the way the experience had deepened our appreciation for each other and for the natural world. You know, Dad said, as we sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I've been fishing for more than 70 years, and I can barely remember most of the fish I've caught. The ones that got away, the trophy fish, the days when the cooler was full, they all blur together after a while. He paused to take a sip of his coffee, and I could see him gathering his thoughts for something important. But I remember every fishing trip I've taken with people I love. I remember the conversations, the laughter, the quiet moments when we were just content to be together. I remember how the light looked on the water, how the air felt, how grateful I was to be alive and sharing that particular moment with that particular person. Is that what today was about? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Today was about showing you that happiness doesn't depend on getting what you think you want, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of hard-earned wisdom. It depends on recognizing the value of what you actually receive. We came here to catch fish, but what we really caught was something much more precious. We caught the experience of being fully present to each other, of sharing something beautiful together, of creating a memory that will outlast both of us. The drive home the next morning was quiet in the most beautiful way. Dad slept peacefully in the passenger seat while I navigated the familiar roads through Michigan's autumn landscape, thinking about everything that had happened and everything I'd learned. Our truck was empty of fish, but my heart was fuller than it had ever been. Over the months that followed, as Dad underwent treatments and faced the daily challenges that come with fighting a disease that couldn't be defeated, we often talked about that fishing trip, and he'd bring it up when the chemotherapy was making him sick, when the uncertainty of his prognosis felt overwhelming, when the reality of limited time threatened to steal his peace. "Remember our day on Lake Michigan?" he'd say when despair tried to settle over him like fog. "Remember how perfect that day was, even though we didn't catch anything?" That's how I want to approach whatever time I have left, looking for the beauty and meaning that's already there, not worrying about what I might be missing. Ed fought courageously for 11 months after our fishing trip, facing each treatment and setback with the same grace he'd shown on the water that October day. He used his remaining time to have important conversations with each of his children and grandchildren, to express love and gratitude that might otherwise have gone unspoken, to model how to face the end of life with dignity and peace. He passed away on a quiet morning in September, surrounded by family in the hospice room that had become his final home, even in his last days, when talking had become difficult. He'd still smile when someone mentioned our fishing trip to Lake Michigan. It had become, for all of us, a symbol of how to find joy and meaning even when things don't go according to plan. At his funeral, I spoke about many things: his dedication to family, his work ethic, his kindness to everyone he encountered, but I spent the most time talking about that fishing trip, about what he'd taught me regarding the difference between what we think we want and what we actually need. Dad taught me that the best catches in life aren't the ones you can measure or weigh or display in a trophy case. I told the gathered friends and family, many of whom were wiping away tears as they remembered their own experiences with a man who had touched so many lives. The best catches are the ones that happen in your heart, moments of connection, experiences of beauty, time spent with people you love. He taught me that success isn't about getting what you set out to get. It's about recognizing the value of what you actually receive. I told him about the salmon that got away, about Dad's reaction to our empty cooler, about the way he'd transformed what could have been a disappointing day into one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. That fishing trip happened 3 years ago now, I continued. And not a day goes by that I don't think about the lessons Dad taught me on the water, when he showed me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about finding joy and meaning even when you're facing loss. He showed me that love isn't about holding on, it's about being grateful for whatever time you're given together. My friends, that fishing trip changed not just how I think about fishing, but how I approach every aspect of my life. Dad's wisdom about finding meaning in empty coolers and joy in unsuccessful expeditions has become the lens through which I view my own aging, my own mortality, my own daily choices about what deserves my attention and energy. I've learned to measure my days not by what I accomplish or acquire, but by the moments of genuine connection I experience. A good conversation with a neighbor, a beautiful sunset observed from my back porch, the taste of coffee shared with Patricia on a quiet morning. These have become my definitions of success. This perspective has become especially important as I've navigated my own senior years. At 65, I'm acutely aware that my time is limited, just as Dad's was. But instead of making me anxious or desperate to achieve certain things before it's too late, this awareness has made me more present to ordinary moments, more grateful for simple pleasures, more attentive to the people and experiences that fill my days. And when I go fishing now, which I do regularly, often to the same spots Dad and I visited over the years, I approach it with his wisdom guiding me. And I still enjoy catching fish when it happens. But I've learned to find equal satisfaction in the days when the fish aren't biting. When success is measured not by what's in my cooler, but by how fully I've experienced the gift of being on the water. I think about other fishermen I encounter, the ones who get frustrated when they're not catching anything, who measure the value of their time by the shin and number of fish they land. I share with them what Dad taught me, that they're missing the real treasure, that the best catches are happening on around them if they just know how to recognize them. But more than that, I think about how Dad's lesson applies to every aspect of life, especially for those of us in our later years. And how often do we define our worth by external measures of success rather than internal experiences of meaning? How often do we feel disappointed because life hasn't given us what we thought we wanted, instead of being grateful for what we've actually received? I think about my fellow seniors who feel like their most valuable years are behind them because they're no longer achieving at previous levels, who measure their significance by their productivity rather than their presence. I want to share with them what Dad taught me, that our worth isn't determined by what we can still accomplish, but by our capacity to appreciate beauty, to connect with others, to find meaning in simple moments. The truth is, my friends, we're all fishing in waters where time is limited. Whether we're dealing with a specific diagnosis like Dad was, or simply facing the reality that comes with aging, none of us knows exactly how many casts we have left. But that uncertainty doesn't have to be a source of anxiety or regret, and it can be a gift that helps us focus on what truly matters. Dad's last fishing trip taught me that what truly matters isn't the fish we catch. It's the time we spend on the water. It's not the achievements we accumulate. It's the relationships we nurture. It's not the problems we solve. It's the moments of beauty we notice. It's not the legacy we leave in terms of accomplishments. It's the love we share and the kindness we show and the presence we offer to the people around us. And every day now, I try to approach life the way Dad approached that fishing trip. And I try to be fully present to whatever experience I'm having. Rather than wishing it was something different, I try to find joy in simple pleasures rather than waiting for major accomplishments to validate my existence. And I try to appreciate the people in my life for who they are, not for what they might be able to give me. This doesn't mean I've stopped setting goals or working toward things I care about, but it means I've learned not to stake my happiness on achieving those goals. My sense of fulfillment comes from the process itself, from the effort I put in, from the relationships I build along the way, from the growth that happens regardless of the outcome. And when I teach my grandchildren to fish, and I do regularly, using the same patient methods Dad used with me, I tell them the same truth he shared with me. The best catches in life aren't fish. They're the moments when you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing it while in what you're supposed to be doing, with the people you're supposed to be with. I tell them that success in fishing, just like success in life, isn't about what you bring home at the end of the day, and it's about how fully you engaged with the experience, how much attention you paid to the world around you, how grateful you felt for the opportunity to be part of something larger than yourself. My friends of us, as we navigate these later chapters of our lives, I encourage you to think about your own fishing trips, the experiences you've had that taught you something essential about what really matters. And maybe it wasn't fishing at all. Maybe it was a conversation with a loved one, a walk through a beautiful place, a quiet moment when you suddenly understood something important about the nature of happiness. And whatever your equivalent of that day on Lake Michigan might be, I encourage you to let it guide how you approach each day you have remaining. And let it remind you that joy doesn't come from getting what you think you want. It comes from appreciating what you actually have. Let it teach you that success isn't about external achievements. It's all about internal experiences of connection, beauty, and meaning. As importantly, let it help you remember that your value as a human being isn't determined by what you can still accomplish, but by your capacity to love and be loved, to notice beauty, to offer kindness, to be present to the miraculous, ordinary moments that make up a human life. The fish we don't catch are just as important as the ones we do. The plans that don't work out often lead to experiences more valuable than the ones we originally had in mind. And the days that don't meet our expectations can still be perfect if we know how to recognize their gifts. Dad taught me that the secret to a meaningful life isn't getting everything you want. It's wanting what you get. And it's finding reasons to be grateful instead of reasons to be disappointed. It's measuring your days by moments of connection rather than achievements unlocked. It's understanding that the best catches in life are the ones that happen in your heart. So the next time you find yourself feeling disappointed because life isn't giving you what you thought you wanted, remember that fishing trip to Lake Michigan. Remember that sometimes the days when we don't catch anything are the most valuable days of all. Remember that success isn't about what you bring home. It's about how fully you show up to the experience. And remember that whether you're 65 or 75 or 85, whether you're dealing with health challenges or family difficulties, or simply the reality of growing older, you still have the opportunity every single day to catch something beautiful, a moment of connection, an experience of wonder, a memory worth treasuring. And the water is still there, my friends. The boat is still seaworthy. The fish may or may not be biting, but the real catch, the one that matters most, is always available if you know how to recognize it. Thank you for spending this precious time with me today, for letting me share this story that's been living in my heart since that perfect autumn day on the water with my father. If a dad's lesson about finding meaning in empty coolers and joy in the catches that matter most has touched your heart, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with love and loss and finding beauty in unexpected places. And if you think someone else might benefit from this reminder about what constitutes life's real treasures, please share this story with them. And sometimes we all need to be reminded that the best things in life can't be measured in conventional ways. That love transcends achievement. That presence is more valuable than productivity. Till next time, I encourage you to go fishing, literally or metaphorically. Mount your line into the waters of possibility, but don't stake your happiness on what you reel in. Instead, find joy in the casting itself, in the time spent on the water, in the people who share the boat with you. The best catches are always the ones that happen in your heart. Take care, and I'll see you soon, SEN.